In 1957, two sisters, 11-year-old Joanna and 6-year-old Jaqueline, were killed in a tragic car accident. Shortly after, their mother became pregnant again and in 1958 gave birth to twin girls, Gillian and Jennifer, who had eerie similarities to their deceased sisters. These similarities included personality traits, birthmarks, and even memories, but not memories that were their memories that belonged to their dead sisters. This is the story of the Pollock Twins, one of the most highly documented cases of reincarnation. If you've not been to the channel before, I'm Kristy, this is Kristy's Coven. Here we talk about all sorts of weird and witchy shit, from spooky things, magic, witchcraft, folklore, mythology, new and full moon rituals, even some yoga videos in there as well. So anything a little bit mystical. If you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe. I am so glad that you found me. So let's travel back to Hexham in England, 1957, where 11-year-old Joanna and her younger sister, 6-year-old Jaqueline, lived with their father John and their mother Florence. John was a Bristol-born man raised in the Church of England, which is a Protestant church, but later on in life he did convert to Catholicism. Florence also converted to the Catholic religion once she met John and they wanted to get married. Together they had 2 other children before they had Joanna and Jaqueline, and together they also ran a milk and grocery delivery business. This meant that they were super busy, so the children did spend a lot of time at their grand's house and Florence's mum's house. Despite there being a 5-year age gap between Joanna and Jaqueline, they were incredibly close. Some would describe them as completely inseparable, and because Joanna was that little bit older, she often took on a kind of mothering role to her little sister, and they both really kind of liked to fall into those roles. One strange thing about Joanna is she would sometimes make comments that were a little bit strange. For instance, she once said, "I will never grow up to be a lady," and people found that quite weird, or it's quite an odd thing to say. On May of 1957, tragedy would fall on the family when a woman who had taken aspirin and barbiturates in an attempt to end her own life decided to get behind the wheel of a car, drove onto the pavement and knocked the 2 little girls down along with their friend Anthony while they were walking on their way to church. The children tried to escape, but they were trapped in by a wall on one side of them, so there wasn't really anywhere that they could run to. Unfortunately, Joanna and Jaqueline would die instantly, and Anthony would die on the way to the hospital. It is believed that the driver may have intentionally knocked the children down because she had recently been forcibly separated from her own children, so it could have been if I can't have my children, nobody can have their children kind of disgusting thing. Of course, the impact of this on the Pollock family was huge and devastating, and as people do, they deal with grief in entirely different ways. So while Florence tried to block out thoughts of her children and really found it too hurtful to almost like think about them and think about where they were now in the accident, she just doesn't have the emotional capacity to kind of deal with that. John was entirely consumed with thoughts of his children. So let's talk about John for a little minute. Like I said, he was always in the Christian faith. However, when he was 9 years old, he was reading a novel, and in this novel they spoke about reincarnation, and this really piqued his interest, and it became something he became a little bit obsessive about. It was just something in it that had like really resonated with him, and he had this deep belief in reincarnation, which of course there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, in the Christian faith, it's not so good to believe. John says that he believed so deeply in reincarnation that when he was in bed at night, he would pray to God for proof of reincarnation so that the whole world could know that he was right. I feel like this is like a relatively normal thing. I think fear and worry about death and the afterlife and what happens to us is relatively normal. I think it's something probably most people go through at a certain time. So it does make sense that sometimes you can get caught up in the idea of really wanting hope that after we die, then it's not just the end. We can maybe live on through reincarnation or through heaven or through some sort of afterlife, because the finality of death is a pretty terrifying thing, and as humans I think we want to believe that there's something more. However, John says that once his children died, he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for all those times that he prayed for proof that reincarnation was real, because he believed that this was the way that God was answering his prayers, almost in a sort of, okay, you'll have your proof that reincarnation is real, but here is the price that you'll have to pay for it. Florence was completely opposed to the idea of reincarnation and did not believe in it at all. She thought that it was a very ungodly concept, and she was very deep into her faith. So the fact that John was so invested in reincarnation and really, really believed it, and she really didn't believe it, and I guess like the pressure of the grief of like losing your children, they two almost got a divorce. However, they did manage to work through their differences, and shortly after the deaths of Joanna and Jaqueline, Florence fell pregnant again. John, still very strong in his beliefs, had a deep intuitive knowing that Florence would give birth to twin girls, and these twin girls would be the reincarnation of his and her daughters who had passed away.
From the moment I knew she was pregnant, I believed that the girls would come back.
This didn't seem very likely though, because twins didn't run in either side of the family, and at a visit to the doctor, a doctor confirmed that there was only one baby because there was only one heartbeat. However, even with all this, John still had this gut instinct that it was going to be twins, and he held strong in this faith. And against all odds, John was right. So on October 4th, 1958, Florence gave birth to twin girls, Jennifer and Gillian. I really don't know why they have spelled all the girls' names Joanna, Jaqueline and Jennifer with a J, but they've chose to spell Gillian with a G when they could just have spelled Gillian with also a J and kept the theme running. I don't know, it's not my baby, it's not my business. So Jennifer was born with 2 birthmarks, one on the left side of her waist and one above her right eye, which of course is nothing strange on its own. However, for John, this served as more proof of reincarnation. Jennifer's deceased sister, Jaqueline, also had a birthmark on the left side of her waist, and she didn't have a birthmark above her right eye. However, when she was 3 years old, she fell into a bucket, and this caused her to have a scar above the right side of her eye, which looked very similar to the birthmark. This is a relatively popular belief that birthmarks that people have in this lifetime can signify to scars, wounds, or even how a person died in a past lifetime. A couple more physical similarities are that Gillian grew up to have more of a slender build, similar to what Joanna had, whereas Jennifer had more of a stocky build like Jaqueline. I really hate the word stocky. I think that's like a really horrid way to describe somebody. Stocky. Like, nothing sounds nice about the word stocky, but that's the word that they used. It was noted at the time by Ian Stevenson, who was a reincarnation researcher who studied the girls after the case made it to the newspaper in 1963. He said that genetics couldn't explain the twins' differences, especially Jennifer having birthmarks and Gillian not having birthmarks, because they were in fact identical twins, and blood tests were done to prove that the girls were identical twins. But I did do some research of my own, and by research I mean like less than 5 minutes on a Google search, and apparently identical twins can have different birthmarks from one another, so there you go. The general consensus seems to be that just because one identical twin has a birthmark doesn't mean that the other identical twin will have the same birthmark, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But this of course doesn't rule out reincarnation altogether. Like I said, birthmarks are a very significant thing in reincarnation cases, and Ian Stevenson himself even says that out of the 895 reincarnation cases that he investigated, 35% of them involved birthmarks. As the girls grew up, the similarities between them and their sisters became much more apparent. So of course their dad had always firmly believed in reincarnation, but Florence, once a complete total non-believer, enough that it was almost enough to break up her marriage, was actually starting to believe that reincarnation was real and that her twin daughters were reincarnations of her other daughters. So like I already said, Joanna really liked to mother her younger sister Jaqueline, which would make sense because there was a 5-year age gap between them. But Gillian also really liked to mother Jennifer and always acted more of a grown-up big sister, even though they were of course twins in the same age. Gillian was described as generous and sociable with other children. She also had an interest in costumes and dress up and acting, much like Joanna had. Both girls liked to comb people's hair, especially their dads, just like their older sisters had. When the girls were learning to write, Gillian held her pencil properly, whereas Jennifer held it upright and in a fist, like Jaqueline had. Now I know this evidence does seem pretty wishy-washy and generic, like all kids like to dress up, loads of kids are generous, half the kids out there must have trouble holding a pencil, most little girls like combing hair. Like, I know it's not exactly like the biggest evidence we've ever seen, but it does get stranger, so just bear with me. So the twins also had a huge phobia of cars. Now Florence did admit that this could be caused by her own fears about her children's safety, just being extra precautious, extra paranoid and worried about her children on the road. But one time while walking down an enclosed alleyway, a car engine revved and John saw the girls cling to each other and cry, "It's the car, it's the car, it's coming for us." A big turning point in how Florence felt about reincarnation is when she decided to give Gillian and Jennifer 2 dolls that had belonged to Joanna and Jaqueline. The girls had never seen these dolls before and they had been stored away in the attic for a really long time, so they had no memory or anything of the dolls. But when Florence had pulled the 2 dolls down from the attic, the girls recognised the dolls right away and they were like, "Oh, that's Mary and that one's Susan," when they had never named them that. They had never seen the dolls before, but the dolls belonged to their sisters and their sisters had named them Mary and Susan. They also knew which doll was theirs and which doll was their sister's doll. There was no like, "Oh, what one do you want? What one do you want?" It was like, "No, this one already belongs to me and that one already belongs to you." And the girls also both says that they remembered the dolls being a gift from Santa Claus, which they were, but not for them.
When I got these 2 dolls out, one said, "Oh, that's Mary and that's Susan." And it was exactly the same names as my other daughters had named them. And that was the sort of really turning point in my way of thinking.
Joanna had also been gifted a toy clothes wringer, and when it got brought down from the attic, Gillian says, "Oh look, it's my toy wringer." So she also remembered that toy as well, which had belonged to her sister. So like I said, Florence and John ran a milk delivery business together. However, when Florence's children died, she stopped working, so she packed her work uniform away. Her work uniform was a smock. So years later, when the girls were about 4.5-year-old, John decides to put on this smock so that he can do some painting and not get any paint on his clothes. So while John was walking around the house wearing this smock, Gillian stopped him and asked, "Why are you wearing Mummy's coat?" And he was like, "What do you mean?" And she was like, "Oh, Mummy wears that to deliver milk." But her mum hadn't delivered milk at any point in her life and hadn't worn that smock at any point in her life. Florence and John both says that they would often hear the girls talking about the car accident. One time Florence found Gillian cradling Jennifer's head and crying, "The blood's coming out of your eyes, that's where the car hit you." And John had says that when he went to go and identify his children's bodies, that Jaqueline's head had been bandaged up just above her eye. It's also worth noting that the family had moved away from Hexham when the girls were about 9 months old, and they went back to visit for the first time when the girls were 4, and the girls were acting as if they knew the area that they couldn't possibly remember from when they were only 9 months old. They were saying things like, "Oh, just down the road over there is the school that we used to go to, and then behind that is the playground that we would often play in." And they were pointing out these landmarks before the landmarks were even visible to them. They knew where the church was, they knew where the park was, and it was just an incredibly strange experience for the family. John and Florence believed so strongly that their daughters had been reincarnated that the graves of their other daughters no longer held any significance to them, with John saying, "To bring flowers or anything would be sheer hypocrisy because I still believe that they're here. It's just a symbol of 2 girls that lived who were reborn."
There's a grave there, but it means nothing. To me, to bring flowers or anything on the grave would be sheer hypocrisy because I don't believe that they're here. I mean, it's just a symbol of 2 girls that lived that were reborn.
As the twins got older, they started to completely forget all memories of their past lives. In fact, they never knew anything about reincarnation until they were about 13-year-old, and their family never told them about it or that they believed that they had been their older sister's reincarnation or anything until they were a little bit older. So with the forgetting of their past memories and all of that, they just kind of went on to live very normal lives. Although they did forget all memories of their previous lives, in 1981, Gillian experienced visions of herself playing in a sand pit with her older brothers, so she could perfectly describe the house, the garden, the lawn, the orchids in a house in Wickham that they had lived in. Well, not actually that she had lived in, but a house that Joanna had lived in when she was about 4 years old, that Gillian had never been to and never seen photographs of, and had never even been to Wickham in general. But she got this really intense vision and memory of being there and describing the place perfectly. Oh my god, bikini! Fucking hell. Do you wanna chill out? So, final thoughts. I know that this case, a lot of it can be explained away or it can be seen as just total coincidences. I guess there are definitely reincarnation cases out there with a lot more solid proof or a lot more compelling evidence. For instance, there's cases of children remembering family members that stay entirely in the opposite end of the world from them, or remembering in great detail their death and being able to explain it even though they had no connection to their past life or their family or anything like that. or cases of children remembering parents that they had in a previous life. So there is a lot stranger and more compelling cases. However, I am somebody who does actually believe in reincarnation, so I would be inclined to lean towards, I guess it could be true. See, my thing is, I am equal parts believer and critical thinker, so while I do think that the girls could have been influenced by their parents, maybe not even consciously, maybe their parents didn't do it on purpose, maybe subconsciously, and maybe that's why they picked up on some stuff, and maybe that's how they knew some things about their older sisters, or perhaps their parents could have been reading a lot deeper into things that the children were saying that they don't often, like maybe if the accident hadn't happened and they just wouldn't have like really like picked up on these things. Children say a lot of weird and crazy shit, and some of it's like quite creepy, so it could be a case of that. I do totally see that point. However, I believe that John and Florence 100% believed that their twins were the reincarnation of their other daughters. And like I said, I do also believe in reincarnation, so I feel like it would be a little bit hypocritical of me to be like, no, that's not true at all, because what do they gain out of lying about that? And at the end of the day, I don't fucking know. I would lean towards, just because the evidence isn't overwhelming doesn't mean it's not true.